Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. The story you were taught to watch. You were told the mystery ended with the shots, that everything worth knowing happened in a few seconds in Dallas, that if you understood how the president died, you would understand the story. But that idea did something important. It trained you to stop looking. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was killed in public. The images were clear. The shock was real, and the direction was set almost immediately. Look here. Not there. Investigations were announced. Files were sealed. Answers were promised later. And the public learned a new habit: waiting. For years, attention stayed locked on the same moment. The motorcade, the sound. The film replayed again and again. But while everyone watched the event, something else was already moving. Power does not freeze when violence happens. It settles. Within days, one figure became untouchable. Not by law, but by meaning. Jacqueline Kennedy. She was seen as a widow, as grief, as dignity. But she was also something else. She was the closest witness to a presidency that would never speak again. She was present when decisions were made about memory, about what would be remembered, about what would never be reopened. The country focused on solving the crime. Almost no one asked a different question. What happens after the story is sealed? Because when a story is sealed, attention moves away from people and toward paper, reports, dates, releases that never quite arrive. But history does not always hide answers in documents. Sometimes it places them in what happens next. Who stays visible? Who disappears? Who is protected? And who is no longer asked to explain anything? The assassination became the center of the search. The aftermath became invisible. And that shift happened quietly, in plain sight. The private crack's power looks solid from the outside, but it breaks in private first. By the early 1960s, people close to John F. Kennedy knew one thing: his public life and his private life did not match. This was not a secret inside the system. It was managed. Affairs were ignored. Rumors were contained. Silence was treated as loyalty. History later framed this as personal behavior, something that didn't matter. But personal behavior matters when it sits at the center of power, because it creates pressure, and pressure always looks for a way out. One name kept returning in whispers, in headlines, in memory: Marilyn Monroe. What matters here is not proof. What matters is visibility. She was visible in a way power could not control. Emotional, unpredictable, public. She did not belong to closed rooms or quiet agreements. She belonged to the open air. That made her dangerous to an image built on order. Inside this tension stood Jacqueline Kennedy. History remembers her as calm, distant, almost untouchable. But distance is not ignorance. She understood how power worked. She understood image. She understood what could never be said out loud. When betrayal cannot be confronted, it does not disappear. It hardens. And silence stops being weakness. It becomes strategy. The White House was not just a home. It was a machine. What was known stayed unspoken. What was tolerated stayed unrecorded. What was denied stayed useful. This is how private cracks become structural. Because when power cannot fix itself in public, it looks for stability elsewhere. After Dallas, the public believed everything changed. But the truth is quieter. Some things were already breaking long before the motorcade arrived. The assassination did not create the fracture. It froze it. And once frozen, it shaped every decision that followed. The untouchable man. There are two kinds of power. One is loud, it wears titles, it asks for votes. The other does not ask. By the time the Kennedy presidency began, Aristotle Onassis belonged to the second kind. He did not run for office, he did not answer questions, and he did not need protection. His power moved across borders, across laws, across governments, ships, oil, routes that nations depend on. This kind of power does not react to events. It waits. When the assassination happened, governments rushed to explain. The public rushed to understand. Onassis did neither, because men like him do not look at chaos the same way. They look for openings. At this point in his life, Onassis already had everything most people want: money, freedom, immunity. He did not need love to survive, and he did not need marriage for comfort. In fact, his emotional life pointed somewhere else. For years, he was deeply tied to Maria Callas. Intense, public, real. If love were the reason, the story would have ended there. But it didn't, which raises a simple question. Why would a man who already had everything seek something different? The answer is not romance, it is position. Some people want wealth, others want access. And access is most valuable when it leads to something sealed. After Dallas, one person carried something no one else did. Not a document, not a file, memory. Jacqueline Kennedy was no longer just a widow. She was the closest living link to a presidency that would never explain itself. She held proximity without obligation, knowledge without testimony, silence without contradiction. To align with her was not emotional, it was strategic. Because through her, one moved closer to a locked chapter of history, without standing in front of cameras, without sitting before committees, without answering a single question. Onassis understood something simple. Power does not need permission, it needs placement. And while the public focused on reports and commissions, another kind of power stayed patient. It did not need to speak. It did not need to act. It only needed to be ready when silence became valuable. The assassination changed the country, but it also shifted gravity. And when gravity shifts, everything begins to move toward it, quietly. The silence that followed after the funeral, the noise faded fast. There were no long interviews, no public reflections, no detailed memories offered to history. Jacqueline Kennedy did not step forward. She stepped away. This was explained as grief, as shock, as dignity. But grief does not require disappearance. What followed was distance, careful, permanent. She did not return to political life. She did not shape later investigations. She did not correct the record. She allowed the story to settle, and then she removed herself from it. History treats this as passive, but silence at this level is never passive. Because silence has weight. It slows questions, it narrows focus, it tells people what not to ask. And then 5 years after Dallas, something happened that changed everything. She married Aristotle Onassis. The reaction was instant. Shock, confusion, anger. Then something else followed. Quiet. The press moved on. Political interest faded. Public questioning lost urgency. Why? Because that marriage placed her somewhere else. Beyond American politics, beyond expectation, beyond reach. She was no longer a public witness. She was protected by distance, wealth, and jurisdiction. From that point on, the closest living witness to a presidency became unreachable, not by force, but by alignment. No investigation ever examined what this silence meant. No report measured its effect. It was treated as personal. But personal choices made by people at the center of power reshape history. So the questions remain, not as accusations, but as facts left unexplored. Why did the most visible widow in the world choose invisibility? Why align with a man whose power lived outside the system? Why did questions fade after this marriage instead of growing louder? And why did the witness disappear while the mystery stayed alive? There are no files that answer this. Because this kind of silence does not come from paperwork. It comes from positioning. Silence is often described as something imposed, but history shows something harder to face. Sometimes silence is chosen, and sometimes it is negotiated. The answer you were never told to look for. For more than 60 years, you were taught to wait for files, to wait for dates, to wait for words that might one day be unsealed. The belief was simple, that the truth lived on paper, that when the right document appeared, everything would finally make sense. So attention stayed fixed on archives, on redactions, on promises pushed further into the future. But while the public waited, something else was already complete. The aftermath had settled. One person stepped out of reach. One alignment created protection. And one chapter of history stopped moving. The search never questioned that outcome. Instead, it circled the same moment again and again. The shots, the seconds, the scene everyone already knew. But power does not reveal itself at the moment of violence. It reveals itself in what becomes impossible afterward. Who no longer speaks, who no longer answers, who no longer needs to. Decades passed, files remained sealed, and the waiting became normal. Not because the truth was hidden, but because attention was trained elsewhere. Governments delay, institutions stall, but power does not wait. It resolves itself through people, through distance, through silence that no one challenges. The assassination was never the only event that mattered. What mattered was what followed. Who disappeared? Who gained insulation? Who stopped being asked? And who benefited from the waiting? Some answers never arrive stamped or signed. They arrive quietly, in outcomes everyone can see, but few are taught to question. This story does not accuse. It does not conclude. It simply asks you to look again. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that the truth was hidden, it's that it was always visible, in plain sight. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time. Wow.